mic.
Good morning. Good morning. I'd like to invite you to take your seats. Am I on the mic? No? Can we hear it? I'm not on. Should I adjust my internal mic? Good morning. I'd like to invite everyone to take their seats as we get started today. Welcome to our first table talk of 2014. I am delighted that you are able to be with us today and to join us for this conversation. As we get started, just a couple of housekeeping details to share with you. If you have not already, I invite you to please put your cell phones on mute so that they don't ring and so that you can focus and the rest of us can focus on the presentation today. Also to make mention of, the restrooms are back there in the kitchen area. Men's restroom is over here to my right and the women's is to the left. We will be breaking today a little bit later than we have in the past. We're going to stop for lunch at 12:30. And I think Tina probably told you as you checked in, but we will be collecting your lunch money over at Shalom Center when we get over there. So please be prepared for that. As we have with our other table talks, we are live streaming today. So we're going to be very intentional. When you have a question, we're going to try to get a mic to you so that those who are viewing remotely will be able to hear what you are asking and also participate in the conversation. For our live stream viewers, if you have a question, I invite you to text that on the dialog box that's on your viewing screen at home. It is my pleasure now this morning to welcome Dr. Ted Campbell. He is the Associate Professor of Church History at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas. He is originally from Beaumont, so he's a local boy. Educated at Lon Morris College, UNT, Oxford University, and SMU. He has served as a congregational pastor in several Methodist congregations, taught at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, Duke Divinity, Wesley Theological Seminary, and then served as president for several years of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. As I said, he is now working at Perkins. He is also a published author and has several publications that you could reference as you Google his name. I am also excited to share with you that he is the founding and charter member of the International Society Opposed to Lengthy Sermons. He is also the founding member of the International Society Opposed to Dangling and Otherwise Distracting Microphones in Sanctuaries. So if you would like to affiliate with either of those groups, please feel free to see him while we are on break later on today. And although he didn't include it in his profile, there is a way that, as he and I were communicating, I think he is also a guitar aficionado. Yep, there we go. So let's begin with a word of prayer this morning. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this glorious day, for safe travel for all who join us today, for the opportunity to hear and to contemplate and to perhaps engage in thoughtful, reflective ways with what Dr. Campbell has to share with us. Help us to open our hearts and minds as we think about the future of our mainline churches and what it means for us as we engage missionally in this context. Bless this time together in our learning and our growing and our conversation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Dr. Campbell.
And I'm actually going to turn the microphone on, make sure we've got it working. Thanks to Jane and to Bishop Kevin for the opportunity to be here. Bishop Kevin was stuck in an automobile with me for 3 hours last fall. and he survived that. And we actually had a great conversation, and I think this invitation partly grew out of that and some presentations that I made at the Louisiana Interchurch Council that went on last fall. I want to share with you at first just a couple of Lutheran culture items that come to me by way of my wife's family. My wife's father grew up in Central Texas, and one of the things I pulled off the wall of our living room this morning is this 1923 monochrome photograph of my wife's grandfather in his confirmation class. He's right there. There's a few guys. The guys are all in the back row, but he's the one you can see that has the kind of surfer haircut there. And the hair pastor is in the front. This was an American Lutheran congregation. No, this was, yes, it was an American Lutheran congregation down in Milam County, near the community of Sharp in Milam County, if any of you know where that location is. They fell from the true faith, I guess, when Missouri built a congregation in the town where they settled, and the Missouri Synod pastor began dating their daughter, and they eventually married her, and so they all became part of a Missouri congregation in Rosebud, Texas, eventually. We also have several of the families Taufscheinen, their baptismal certificates. This is a beautiful confirmation certificate for my wife's grandmother, whose name was Alma Friederika Schroeder. And I'm just trying to build some street cred with Lutherans here, by doing all this stuff. But beautiful, beautiful certificates. All of them are, and some of them in very, very elaborate frames, which just show you how utterly important baptism and confirmation and marriages were in that Texas Lutheran culture of that particular time. I actually have the corresponding confirmation certificate from this particular occasion when my wife's grandfather was confirmed, but it's falling apart, and I didn't want to subject it to further disintegration. But I show these to my students as a way of showing them something about the kind of local culture of Lutheranism and how it was affected in Texas. In my own life, there have been two Lutheran books that have been deeply influential on me. One of them will not surprise you, but I had a sort of Methodist-style evangelical conversion experience in my sophomore year in high school in Beaumont, Texas. Following that, I went to church camp that summer, and everybody was talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I bought my first theological book, Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship. For a nerdy Methodist recently from a conversion experience, this is a really good book to start with. And I've treasured it. You can see my high school. It took me a year to get through it. And you can see all my high school notations, even a notation card from a friend to whom I loaned the book, and he made notations on an old library checkout card from the University of North Texas there. So that, and then the other book is a mystery to me, so I'm going to ask you a Lutheran question, not to answer right now, but the other book that really influenced me was a Lutheran daily prayer book that I purchased new around 1975. I can't recall the name of it. It was a red book, really beautiful book, paperback with a gold cross and gold lettering stamped on the front of it. A kind of breviary, and the inside was beautifully printed in black and red, sort of traditional liturgical colors. I'd like to find a copy of that book, and I can easily find stuff like that on eBay and sources like that. But I can't remember the title of it, but it was a Lutheran daily prayer guide that sort of inspired me to work on a daily prayer regimen for the Methodist congregation of which I'm a part. Now, what I'm speaking on today is death of the Mainline, not, or as I've put it in other places, Mainline churches dealing with rumors of our death. I am basically a historian, and that puts me at a disadvantage in these kinds of conversations. Historians would like to say that history includes everything up to yesterday afternoon, which means that we are experts at everything and probably nothing, the way that usually goes. But my expertise is really in the 18th century. John Wesley and other evangelical clergy in that particular period. But I've been concerned for a long time about the way the discussion has gone in the United States in the last 40 years or so about the status of what were one time called mainline churches, sometimes now called old line denominations, and so forth. And some of what I think are the consistently misleading stories that are told about our churches together. So what I'm going to do today is 3 or possibly 4 things. I've got 4 parts of a presentation. I really don't want you to hear the 4th part of it because that's where I'm at my most vulnerable and least degree of expertise. But we might get there if I run out of time or something. So help me with discussion and keep us from the 4th part. The first part is simply going to be called the rumors, dealing with this current status of rumors about mainline churches, old line churches, about religion in general, perhaps. The second part will be something more about the facts and ought to recognize as strengths of these particular Christian denominations. And the 4th part, this is the one I don't really want to do, is the more practical thing about what might be edifying practices for our churches to engage in. And I think it's important. It's just where, as I say, I'm at my least comfortable. I'm also not a very good statistician. I was presenting this to a group in the last weekend, and someone there said, well, have you considered the mean and the mode and the something else? And I said, absolutely not, and I'm not going to because I really have no knowledge of that field. You will find that my knowledge is limited by my United Methodist context, and so part of this is, as I did to the ecumenical group in Louisiana last year, my way of asking you, does this make sense to ELCA folks and what you're seeing in your congregations? So first of all, then, let me say something about what I understand by the term mainline. I don't like it, first of all. Almost nobody does these days. It's a railroad term, actually, which is not a bad thing at all. And it refers specifically to Philadelphia. If you've ever visited Philadelphia, you know that the main line comes out from the town going out west to the affluent suburbs. So it is a term that is charged with meaning, some of which are good meanings and some of which are bad meanings, but part of the meaning is we are the mainstream and the others are kind of odd exceptions to the rules, but it carries the implications of affluence, of cultural authority, all sorts of things that we either lament today or that in some ways may no longer be accurate. As a historian, though, I would say that the churches that we identify historically as mainline churches are a group of churches that originated in the colonial period or close to the colonial period in the United States or in North America in general. I'm going to include disciples of Christ among the mainline churches, and if we do that, we have to extend the period of origin to the 1820s, 1830s, something like that, but colonial period or close to the colonial period in North America. All of these denominations have been significantly involved in the ecumenical movement of the 20th century. That's why Bishop Kevin and I were both present at the Louisiana Interchurch Council that met right near the headquarters of the Duck Dynasty last fall. I thought I could go by there and at least take a selfie, in front of the Duck Dynasty place, but they didn't think that was an important part of my cultural integration into the location there. Ecumenical involvement, and I'm going to contrast mainline churches with another overlapping body of Christian communities we'll call evangelical or conservative evangelical denominations that typically, at least until quite recently, have not been very much engaged with the ecumenical movement, at least in its formal or conciliar expressions. Another identifying trait of what we call mainline churches is that they were significantly involved in the social gospel movement early, not in the 10th century, as the slide says, but actually the 20th century, and in the civil rights movement from the 1960s, and pushing that forward, I would say, with the women's movement, the feminist movement of the 1970s and forward, and with concerns about rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people in more recent decades. Again, taking more progressive stances on those issues, and again, a kind of contrast to the patterns of conservative evangelical churches. So I do make this contrast with evangelical Protestant churches, for example, Southern Baptist Convention and independent evangelical churches, a lot of the evangelical megachurches. Now for Lutherans, I have to issue the first of a series of apologies. That is, I know that the term evangelical has a different kind of weighting in your history. So if you know the German way of making this distinction, what I'm talking about when I say evangelical here is what they call evangelikal as opposed to evangelische. Evangelische can sort of a generic meaning is anything that has to do with the gospel and a sort of a general Christian thing. But in Northern European cultures, often evangelical and reformed are ways of referring to roughly the Lutheran and Calvinist traditions. You find that also in Spanish-speaking contexts where evangelico really carries the meaning of Protestant as contrasted with Catholic and so forth. But here I'm going to say this is more like evangelikal, or as I observe German people pronouncing this, typically with a grimace, evangelikal, so it means the more pietistically inclined versions of Protestantism, those that have put an emphasis on heartfelt religious experiences like the conversion experience that I described to you that I had in my sophomore year in high school. But there's a great overlap, really, between what I'm calling evangelical Protestant churches and mainline churches. Southern Baptists probably follow more the evangelical pattern I'm describing. American Baptist churches I will include among the mainline denominations. And within my church, the United Methodist Church, you can make a pretty strong case that in 1850, we were solidly on the evangelical side of things despite our origins in an 18th century movement that may not have been quite like that. And we have changed and evolved over the last century and a half into something rather different, but evangelical in the sense in which I'm defining it here really is part of our heritage as United Methodists. So specifically, I'm going to name 7, 8, or 9 denominations that I consider to be the core of mainline churches that I'm studying. First, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You probably know that the AME Church is a large, historically black denomination in the United States, not typically counted among mainline churches, but I think that it shows most of the patterns that I've used to describe mainline Christian groups in the United States, including a rather strong movement toward liturgical use in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century. I would also include the AME Zion and the CME churches, all sister Methodist denominations. The problem is I just don't have as good a set of statistics on those denominations, AME Zion and CME, as I have on these other churches. I'm including the American Baptist churches in this category. a group that after the splits in the 1840s between Northern and Southern Baptists, this is a group that called themselves the Northern Baptist Convention for a while, but have spread through the United States and so call themselves the American Baptist Churches now. I'm going to include the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. You probably know there's a complex history there from a movement associated with guys named Campbell, so I kind of like this, in the frontier of the United States, the Appalachian frontier in the 1820s and 1830s. They were Scots-Irish Presbyterians who became Baptist for a while, and then by the 1830s they said, we don't need to be a denomination, we are just going to be plain old Christians, Churches of Christ or Disciples of Christ. And around 1900 they kind of divided into 2 or 3 different groups, with one group becoming the more conservative Churches of Christ associated with Abilene Christian University here in Texas, the groups that typically don't use musical instruments in worship, and the more mainstream-leaning Disciples of Christ that through their evolution since 1900 have come to look more and more like traditional Methodist, Presbyterian, and other mainline churches. I'm including, of course, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I'm including the Episcopal Church in the USA, all of those going back to colonial foundations. The Presbyterian Church in the USA, I've got another misspelling in the slide. It says the Presbyterian Church on the USA, whatever. And then a group called the United Methodist Church. You may have heard of this group. That's my denominational affiliation. And a group called the United Church of Christ that is not as strong in this part of the country as it is on the East Coast, and especially the Northeast and the upper Midwest, actually. But the UCC has very little to do with the conservative groups that we call Churches of Christ here in Texas. But the UCC is the group that President Obama belonged to in Chicago. Trinity UCC congregation is a very progressive and, interestingly, culturally evangelical congregation. Their pastor's wife was a student at the theological school where I served as president for a while. And UCC denomination has some congregations in Texas that you may know because they originated with the old E&R denomination that had some Lutheran background to that particular group. Complicated story, but those are the groups that I'm going to include. As I say, the terms mainline and bad news for Lutherans, even Protestant, tend to have a negative weighting today. Deprecated and often disavowed. I can't tell you how many times I hear United Methodists and Presbyterians saying, well, we're United Methodists. We're really not Protestants. We're really not mainline. We're Presbyterians. We're really not Protestant. We're not mainline church. We're different. I think it's more wishfulness than historical description and so forth. Kind of like the names of denominations that have started to elide the denominational identifiers. So once upon a time, there was a church in Dallas that was called the Prestonwood Baptist Church. And now if you see all the signs, it's the Prestonwood Church. Okay, they've just removed Baptist, kind of like the fellowship churches that, so far as I can tell, are as Baptist as any groups I can imagine, but the marketing departments don't seem to like the denominational tags these days. So we get United Methodist churches that will say Faith Bridge Community, and then in fine little print it'll say a United Methodist Community or something like that. You know, you don't want to say that too far out loud. So the rumors, to get to it, and here I'm going to actually read to you a bit of the fun part that I've had writing this. This is in what my wife describes as my blogger voice, which is not my university professor voice. I'll return to the university professor in a while, but But here I'm just having fun, so I'm going to exaggerate things, and please understand as I read some of this that this is a slightly different voice. It's a bummer to wake up in the morning and realize that you're dead or dying. But that's the way it's felt for folks in America's older non-Catholic churches for the last 4 decades. Yes, that means you, Lutherans and Presbyterians and UCC and Methodists and Episcopalians and even some Baptists. You're dying. Wait, that means me. We're dying. And it's worse than that. Not only are we dying, but we don't believe in Jesus. We're faithless. Every one of us. We're probably not even Christians anymore. And we're stupid because we don't even realize how dying and faithless we are. Now, don't give me any crap. Sorry, I know this is, but the denominational publishing house probably won't allow that word, so don't get fret about it. But don't give me any crap about how you see signs of life and younger people in your congregations. Goody for you. But that doesn't matter. Popular opinion has already judged our churches, and it doesn't really matter what is actually happening in them. Judgment has been pronounced. Dying, faithless, stupid. Even some leaders in our churches seem to agree. Now, just a little background. In 1972, a staff member at the National Council of Churches in the U.S., Dean Kelly, one of my fellow United Methodists, introduced a startling original thesis in a book called Why Conservative Churches Are Growing. Dean Kelly wasn't complaining. I think he was telling the truth. But folks in mainline churches were absolutely stunned at Kelly's claim that conservative denominations and independent congregations in the United States were growing and that older churches were losing ground to them. Folks from the older churches, and I remember this, 1972 is the year when I graduated from high school. I remember very well that folks from older churches reacted with scorn and dismissal. Conservatives, they imagined, were stupid, uncultured turkeys who didn't keep up with the times. Only idiots would be attracted to their churches. Surely it was a blip, and the old-line, mainline churches with their beautiful sanctuaries and advanced cultures and progressive outlooks would come back and kapow, beat the crap out of these pretenders. Well, the dust is cleared, and Kelly was on target. By the time he died in 1997, his thesis was thoroughly vindicated. Wouldn't you love to be an academic person who writes something that's controversial for 30 years, and then it turns out to be absolutely true? Like a dude in England named Higgs, who back in the 1960s thought that there was this subatomic particle, and then July 4th, a year ago, they say, guess what? He's right. And just yesterday, did you read the story about the inflationary universe? Stanford University released a video of the guy from the team that did the experiments going over to the home of the older professor who had theorized this 20 or 30 years ago and informing him, guess what? After 20 or 30 years of discussion, you're right after all. All of us as academics would love to have that happen. Kelly was thoroughly vindicated. The groups that he called conservative churches, and I think one of the problems is in the title of his book. It sort of left us supposing that they're conservative and we're what? It sort of led to the stereotype, not conservative or something like that. But the groups that he called conservative churches were growing up until about 5 or 10 years ago, as we're going to see. It's also true that most of them that have really grown in the last 40 years have started to look suspiciously mainline and a lot less fundamentalist than they did back then. Kelly was also right in claiming that older denominations were declining in membership. So if you hoped that I was going to come here today and say, it's not true, we're not declining in membership, sorry, I'm going to have to disappoint you once again and offer my apologies, but that's not what I'm going to say. Part of my problem with this book I'm writing is that we just haven't found a title for it yet. The publisher wanted me to do something like Good news! God is in the resurrection business. And it's just way too upbeat. The news is not that good. It's just, maybe I'm more of a Lutheran than at least this is Garrison Keillor's stereotype of Luther. He can't get into that good news kind of, that sort of thing. It's not that good a news, but if you expected me to say that, I can't say that. But I'm going to say some other things about the strength of mainline churches. Kelly's book set the stage for discussions in old line U.S. churches for the decades to come. Although seldom examined carefully, his research stimulated a pattern of repetitious writing that has grown like an out-of-control cancer into horrendous stereotyping and brutal overt scorn for mainline churches in popular American culture, even on the part of members and leaders of our churches. A catastrophe of biblical proportions. The apocalypse come to our churches. The image of weak and declining churches has been carried forward in the last 40 years, moreover, by news services in the United States, consistent with their general sense that religion itself is a dying relic of the past. Early in the year 2001, only one major U.S. news organization had a national-level religion reporter. That was ABC's World News Tonight, and they fired Peggy Waymeyer, who, by the way, came from the Dallas area. They fired Peggy Waymeyer without replacement a few months before the 9/11 attacks. Who needs a religion reporter? And after 9/11, the news feeds bared their massive ignorance about religion, especially about Islam. But really, at the time that happened, I was serving at Garrett Evangelical Seminary on the campus of Northwestern University. We had a joint program with the Medill School of Journalism, sponsored by a Lilly grant, and it was basically a boot camp for reporters to learn about religion. And I'm not making this up. We would bring them into a church and we would say, now this is what we call the pulpit. Oh, they make a pulpit. And this is what we call a pew. And we'd take them in a synagogue. We'd take them in a mosque and so forth. And honestly, they had no idea. Most of them had grown up in families that had no connection to religion whatsoever, and it was just ABC, Religion 101 that we were basically doing with them. The news feeds reported correctly in 2010 that there were no more Protestants on the Supreme Court of the United States, a body that at one time consisted solely of Protestants, in the not-too-distant past, in fact. In October 2012, they reported that a majority of United States citizens no longer identified themselves as Protestants. These developments were widely attributed to shrinkage of the old-line Protestant churches, easy targets. It was scarcely noted that in this case Protestant included conservative evangelical groups as well as the older historic Protestant churches of the USA. Much bigger things were happening than the shrinkage of the older churches. But the impression you'd get from reading these news accounts is that if you attended an Episcopal or United Methodist or UCC or Presbyterian or ELCA congregation today, you'd see mostly empty pews with a scattering of wrinkled-up old farts just about to die, barely able to pay to keep the heat running in their decrepit sanctuaries, while they argue with their faltering halitosis-infected dying breaths about ordaining gay people. In a few months, they'll all croak, and there won't be any more Methodists or Presbyterians or Lutherans or UCC folk or Episcopalians to worry about, and good riddance. Stupid, unfaithful, dying, dead and gone. I'm having fun with this, you can tell. No, actually, it would be difficult to get even that impression from news feeds which largely ignore old-line churches, except, for example, when Chelsea Clinton marries a Jewish guy, and then Methodists, in this case, get a throwaway line from Jon Stewart. Must be easy being Methodist. It's like the University of Phoenix of religion. Thank you very much. I couldn't find a good Lutheran one to parallel that, It's why I would say our media campaign from 15 years ago that had open hearts, open minds, open doors, may have played against us as United Methodists because it sort of played into that stereotype that Methodists basically stand for nothing, and I've spent a good deal of my career sort of working against that impression, but it's very strong out there among United Methodists and in the culture at large. We also get a lot of attention from news services when any of us argue about homosexuality. There's got to be a memo to reporters somewhere that says you are strictly not to mention the UMC or the PCUSA or the ELCA or the Episcopal Church or the United Church of Christ unless they are arguing about gay people. Under no circumstances may you report anything they're doing that could be construed as good. For the news feeds, it seems to me, Christianity now means fundamentalist Protestants and conservative Catholics, just as Islam means radical Shiite terrorists and Judaism means Orthodox synagogues and maybe some Lubavitcher Hasidim to add a little flair. Middle of the road and more progressive Christians, Jews, and Muslims don't seem to count at all, even if they have or we have traditional beliefs. They're just boring. They're not blowing up anything, just praying and worshiping and building hospitals and universities and opening clinics for poor people. Snore. What a bunch of losers. U.S. society at large has developed an image of our churches based on monstrously exaggerated rumors, I think only distantly grounded in Kelly's original research. The truth is that they haven't got a clue what's going on in our churches, but they sure do think they do, and they're very happy to share their immense wisdom about our failures, as we shall see. What really hasn't helped has been a series of books that have come out every few years since 1972, written mostly by people in old-line denominations and whose content can be summarized as follows. And in my book, this is going to be all in screaming capital letters, but it goes something like this. Wow, people, I've got some stunning news for you. Nobody's ever thought of this before. Churches are growing, and mainline churches are declining. You're declining. You're going to die. The sky is falling. You're imbeciles, faithless, immoral imbeciles. It's horrible. It's depressing. It's dreadful. Nobody's ever thought of this before until my book came out. And then a few months later, it's, wow, people, have I got some stunning news for you. Nobody's ever thought of this before. Conservative churches are growing. Mainline churches are declining. It's horrible. It's over and over and over again. They sort of caught on to this idea, and it's being repeated. My comment is, holy crap, Batman. It really was original in 1972 for Dean Kelly. Now it's just, if you'll pardon this word, it's just bitching. And very unoriginal bitching at that. Tell me something new. It's puzzling, just to take the example close to my experience, and you could probably give an ELCA parallel to this. It's puzzling for the 3 million people who worship at United Methodist congregations every week in the United States. People in large congregations, middle-sized suburban congregations, people in little white-frame rural churches, people in huge congregations that function like United Methodist megachurches, gay people, lesbian people, black people, white people, Latino people, people who couldn't tell you if they're black or white or whatever to save their souls. It's puzzling for United Methodist people singing Charles Wesley hymns, attending Walk to Emmaus retreats, Methodist camps, disciple Bible study groups, hymn sings, revivals, and, of course, covered dish suppers, the third sacrament in our tradition. It's especially puzzling for United Methodists and thriving congregations today who have to presume, based on the news feeds and the horror stories, that their congregation is the only exception to the rule, and every other congregation in the denomination must be decrepit and dying. And this is one of the things that we see. I think it's one of the most difficult and damning signs that we have, is that pastors of large churches now have to presume that because their church is thriving, they've got the answers. I mean, it leads to this kind of almost sort of a hubris that says, we here at the Bug Tussle Church know exactly how to build a church, and all of the rest of the people in our denomination are failing, so you should come here and learn, and so on and so forth. It's just a big problem that we see across the board. But as I say, that's what they're saying out there in pop culture and the news feeds, and could the news feeds be wrong or mistaken even in the slightest degree? I mean, when they're reporting about religion. The image of declining churches, oh, I didn't mean to go to Rick Santorum that fast. Sorry about that. We'll get there. The image of declining churches gives us every special interest group in our churches, and for that matter, just about every individual with an opinion, a grounds for saying that the decline is due to the fact that the churches haven't followed their ideas or their programs. Denominational meetings, trust me, I know what I'm talking about, have too often devolved into bitch sessions about who's responsible for the demise of the denomination. And the cardinal rule of the bitch session is this: it's not me, it's somebody else. It's those people, whoever they are out there. Just in the last week or two, one of the guys who works in the sound and light department at the church that I attend in Dallas, Lovers Lane United Methodist Church, sent me some clippings about the decline of mainline denominations, and it reported correctly the information about the decline. But it said unequivocally the reason is the liberalism of all of these churches. That's why they're declining. Now, they have evidence for the decline, and my question that I said back to the guy, give me the evidence that the reason is because of the liberalism of our churches. But then on the other hand, you got liberal people saying the same thing. The decline is there, it's because of those conservatives. It's because of their, they're not keeping up with the times. So it sort of gives everybody an occasion to say it's everybody else's fault. It seems like, from the perspective of people outside of our churches, that issues about whether we should ordain gay people or perform unions of gay people have now overshadowed everything else we do. As they seem to imagine us, we don't worship the Divine Trinity anymore, we don't celebrate the Lord's Supper, we don't preach sermons, we don't sing hymns or evangelize or serve the poor. We spend all our time arguing about gay people. Every service, every church meeting, that's all we do, right? Isn't that what happens every hour of every day in your congregation? No. Well, what kind of weird congregation do you attend? Now, here's the point where U.S. Representative Rick Santorum has given us a provocative soundbite illustrating how the folks out there see people in old line or mainline churches. Speaking at Ave Maria University in 2008, in what sounds in the audio recording like an off-the-cuff comment, the Catholic presidential hopeful declared, quote, "And of course we look at the shape of mainline Protestantism in this country, and it is in shambles. It is gone from the world of Christianity as I see it." Thanks especially for that "of course." Of course, the conclusion just seems perfectly obvious. All of our churches are gone from the world of Christianity. I think he meant that we're not just declining, we've basically given up on the Christian faith. I'm tired of sitting back and letting people like that define who we are. That's one of the reasons why I really do have some passion about this particular issue. Think about what he meant just within the scope of his own political party. Laura and George W. Bush attend the United Methodist congregation, the one on the campus of Southern Methodist University, gone from the world of Christianity. Barbara and George H.W. Bush and Colin and Alma Powell all attend Episcopal churches, gone from the world of Christianity. Condoleezza Rice, whose great-grandfather, she explained to us at SMU, was John Wesley Rice, attends a Presbyterian church, gone from the world of Christianity. Holy smokes. And Rick Santorum is far from the only person who sees the older Protestant churches in that way. Writing on, quote, "the death of Protestant America," close quote, in a publication called First Things. You know about First Things. It's an interesting kind of Catholic and evangelical publication. But a guy named Joseph Bottom made much more specific his sense that older churches have abandoned traditional Christian faith. This is a quotation. "The names may vary, but the topics remain the same. The uniformity of social class at church headquarters." Anybody got some statistics on social class at church headquarters? I just wonder where he came up with this. "The routine genuflections toward the latest political causes, the feminizing of the clergy," oh my goodness, what worse could happen, "the unimportance of the ecclesial points that once defined the denomination, the substitution of leftist social action for Christian evangelizing, and the disappearance of biblical theology. All the mainline churches have become essentially the same church. Their histories, their theologies, and even much of their practice lost to a uniform vision of social progress. Only the names of the corporations that own their properties seem to differ." Okay? All the mainline churches have become essentially the same church. We are just wretched. We're just awful. We're stupid and faithless and dying. It's astonishing. Do you think Joseph Bottom had actually attended Methodist and ELCA congregations before delivering the judgment that we've all become the same church? We might hope that his and Rick Santorum's formidable theological judgments were grounded in careful study of the doctrinal commitments, the liturgies, the ecumenical and social commitments of contemporary Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, UCC, AME, and United Methodist churches, but folks, I doubt it. I don't think they know much about our churches, despite the fact that they claim sufficient expertise to make these enormous public pronouncements. I think they just drank in whatever vomit the pop culture threw up about the hideous mainline churches and then spat it back out at Ave Maria University and in the pages of First Things. You don't have to like it, but I think it's not just Rick Santorum and Joseph Bottom. I think that's what they're really saying out there about us. All our churches are gone from the world of Christianity. You and me and George W. Bush and Laura Bush and George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush and Condoleezza Rice. We all attend churches solemnly decreed to be gone from the world of Christianity. Dead, faithless, stupid. Anybody want to dare a contrary view? That's what I'm working with, okay? So that's the end of my performance of that little section of my book. When I walk over this way, are we losing the people yeah. You know what I hear, yeah, you need it broad enough. You know, what I hear is that Billy Graham succeeded as an evangelist because he stands still. These old-fashioned revivalists would jump up and run around, and the old TV cameras couldn't follow them. Kind of like, have you ever seen the clip on YouTube of, what was this guy's name? Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan show, and they told the cameramen not to show his hips, and so the cameras are just going crazy trying not, and they're not succeeding at it. But in any case, sorry, I'm thinking about the thing. Yeah, you got me there. Okay, hello there. Right, that's what I'm dealing with, and I want to deal with the image of our churches, and I want to deal with some of the facts. This is not as good news, not as strong a knot as you might want to hear. Because what I'm going to say is, yes, membership in our churches is declining. Worship attendance is declining. And yet, I think there's some good news in this. The case I'm going to try to make is the case that there is a substantial, stronger core than people outside of our churches realize. Everybody I know within our churches knows that's true. That when you go to an ELCA church or you go to a most United Methodist churches, when you go to Episcopal churches, you find a very strong core of committed people, not just older people either. A faith that's being, I would say, successfully transmitted to new generations. And part of what I'm going to argue eventually here is these groups that are called mainline churches never were really mainline. We never were. In any time since the Civil War, we have never been a majority of the U.S. population, and typically much smaller than that. But we'll look at some of that later. I just wonder if the material that I've presented you here from John Stewart and Rick, you like that? John Stewart and Rick Santorum sort of paired off together. I wonder if that makes sense to you. Are you hearing rumors like that, or do you think that's the impression that people have of our churches? And we've got Preacher Jane Marr there with a microphone. If anybody, yes, here we are. Okay, sorry. I see that hand, and she runs away from you. Okay. Okay, what do we got? Yeah, thank you.
I pastor a small congregation here in the Metroplex, and I have a few friends who are not Christian. They do not attend church, and recently one of them posted something about, it was a graphic that was out on social media about churches paying taxes.
Right.
And the comments that he and all his friends posted were very much about churches are for-profit organizations, and and everything was obviously based on what they're hearing in the media about the big churches and everything like that.
That's a big issue coming, by the way. A lot of people are convinced that you should end.
I don't engage these conversations very much on Facebook because I don't necessarily find that helpful. However, I actually commented it because this is a thoughtful person, and he doesn't usually get wrapped up in all of these things. And so I felt the need to sort of address this with him, and I literally made a comment, publicly, and I said, look, the majority of Christians in the United States are actually worshiping in very small congregations that are actually some of us are having a hard time. And I said, I recently had to take a pay cut and go to part-time, and we're dealing with that. Now, my church is responding very favorably, and we are taking it as a life-giving, measure and everything, a way for us to focus on lay leadership and mission rather than this thing. But I wanted him to realize that not every church out there
Right.
is this huge money-grubbing
Right.
organization.
Yep.
And the conversation kind of after that.
It just died.
One guy said, well, those bigger churches still need to pay. And that's all. And then the conversation kind of ended after that. And it was just really, really kind of eye-opening for me, because that's what people outside, that's what they're exposed to. That's what they see.
That's right.
And it was kind of disturbing,
That's right.
actually.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you're on target. If you go back to the 1950s, there was a Life magazine issue. Now, anybody remember Life magazine? It was this big magazine that had a lot of photojournalism and so forth. And there was an issue about religion in America, and it was all about Methodists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Baptists. Almost no mention of evangelicals at all, and almost no mention of Catholics. They were all just seen as kind of weird, odd things. So there's such a turnaround now that, as you were suggesting, when people think of Christianity now, they don't think of us. They think of mega churches or Catholicism and so forth. The other thing I hear from folks that I'm connected to on the internet and other sources, one of the things about the internet, you see comments that you probably wouldn't see if you just stayed in a Methodist Sunday school somewhere, or a Lutheran Sunday school. And you often see the idea, religion means hate. What people do in churches is they teach people to hate each other. They teach people to be violently inflamed with passion, and that's the root of most of the problems in the world today. So if we could just do away with religion. Think about John Lennon's song about Imagine, which I like very much, actually. I mean, my generation and so forth. But the song seems to suppose that religion is about hating people. So we've got an enormous image problem. Like you say, it's about hating people, it's about money grubbing, and so forth. All right, we're descending into the abyss here. Other views of how people perceive us. Here's a microphone, so our...
At least we're not quite as bad on the approval rating as Congress is.
Okay, thank you very much. And you know something that shocked the United Methodists? The Southern Baptists recently commissioned a study of what are the most trusted religious groups in the United States, and somehow the UMC came out on top of that. And we ourselves just went, what? I mean, I thought, but yeah, it's not as bad as other groups. I'm not politically agnostic, but my funding goes to a group called No Labels, nolabels.org if you're interested. But it's a group that's trying to get Democrats and Republicans sort of focusing on what we need to do to work together, but partly in response to that dreadfully negative image of Congress and politicians in general that people seem to have. I think the kind of political advertising we've been hearing in Texas for the last several months probably doesn't help the cause, Impressions. Bishop. I'm going to let the bishop have the final word before we...
Well, I was going to let others go ahead of me, but since nobody had their hand up, let me just make a comment. One of the things I've observed since I've become a bishop is how really tenacious our congregations are in hanging on and continuing to try to figure out what they can do in mission and ministry. We are experiencing a growth in the number of congregations that are closing in these days. I think this is kind of a boomerang effect of our discussions about homosexuality back in 2009. I think we'll get through that. But we're starting new congregations as well. The thing is, it's different these days. We're not starting successfully what you might call the traditional Anglo-suburban ELCA congregations. We are starting congregations that are reaching out to and being started by Hispanic Latino folks and by other Southern Hemisphere people who have come among us, Oromo, Umoja, and so forth. So I appreciate what you're saying to us here. Ministry, I think, will be different for our congregations in the midst of the change that's happening in the church. But I think we're still as vital as we've ever been.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to address some of those demographic changes. It is a problem for all of the older churches because if you think about it, each of the old line, mainline denominations had a particular ethnic constituency. You know what it is. I mean, run all the Lutheran stereotypes about Ollie and Lena and so forth, and you get it. But Methodists were really stuck in British American and African American ethnicities. Presbyterian, Scots-Irish groups, Baptists kind of follow the Methodist pattern, British American and African American groups. UCC were the older New England Congregationalists with the Lutherans and German Reform folks that united with them. But we've not done a good job until quite recently at breaking out of the enclave. So Lover's Lane, where I attend in Dallas, the church with arguably the weirdest name of any around, Lover's Lane has 5 African fellowships representing different African constituencies, and they're just booming. And as you suggested, Bishop, largely natively led by African people who have come to the United States, and that's where we're seeing a lot of growth. Super. I'm going to suggest we take a break and grab some coffee, and those pastries are wonderful. I mean, that's not right for Lent, is it? I mean, that's just like like having apple pie for breakfast or something. That's great stuff. Let's take a 5 or 10 minute break, and then we'll come back.
going to invite you to come back to your tables. It's a thankless proposition. Way to listen. I'll invite you guys to come back to your tables. All right. Folks, yeah, I know. Folks, I'm going to invite you to take your seats again. Time? Yeah. No, Bishop doesn't like that. Can I invite you to come back to your tables, please? Thank you. Apparently, I do need Steve Knaus here to do that loud whistle of his. That is not a training that I received in my liturgics class in seminary. So, just a couple of housekeeping details. I have been told that the beverages, the coffee, the hot water, and the decaf are a little bit cooler. And so I've let Matt know, and we'll see if we can get some hot coffee. Also, we're out of regular. So I have started a pot in the kitchen. The handle that says decaf is actually regular coffee I just brewed. The pot that's up on top is hopefully decaf. That was made before I got here, God willing. Living on the edge, yes. So if you're concerned about your caffeine, don't drink either. Just a brief mention. I wanted to let you know, I don't know, probably most of you know by now that Jean Oswald slipped on ice here at Briarwood last week and broke her ankle. And so they made a decision that she needed to have surgery, and that was this morning. We did just receive word that she is out of surgery, and thanks be to God, there is no ligament damage. So that is the good news. Please continue to hold Jean in your prayers. So with that, I'll invite Dr. Campbell to return.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for comments that are helping me think about this matter. I've actually got some statistical material that I want to share with you. Let me take one so that I'm sure I have one myself, and then if Russell, if you could help me ush this side, and you could help me they're ushering on that side, we can get these materials out. One of the problems that I've perceived is that the kinds of statistics that Dean Kelly was looking at were really statistics just from the last few decades. In other words, he was looking at statistics from basically the 60s, maybe extending into the 1950s. And as a historian, I always want to take a somewhat bigger context and look at things that have been happening for a longer strain of time. So I'm going to look at a few statistics, and then I'm going to look at some explanations of what some of the phenomena are that we're looking at. There I'm going to exercise my role as a historian. Now, the first thing you see is a table that shows mainline denominational membership, 1925 to 1975. I should indicate on here, and I need to put it down here, that the source that I have for this is a group called the American Religious something or another association. I think it's ARDA, who have a website in which they aggregate statistics from a number of different denominations. The problem I faced here was that as you move back in time, you have to deal not only with an ELCA, but with, in 1975, at least two predecessor groups. And when you get back to 1950 and 1925, it becomes very, very complex indeed. So for the United Methodist Church, 2000 and 1975, it is the United Methodist Church. In 1950, I have to add together figures from the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church. And in 1925, I have to add figures from 5 different denominations, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, the Methodist Protestant Church, the Evangelical Association or Evangelical Church, which was also in a state of division at that point, and united brethren in Christ. So, complicated picture. And I got to tell you that the Lutherans are the most difficult of all in that respect. I mean, when I started going back, I could hardly believe the complexity of this. It was like in 1925, every street corner in Minneapolis had its own Lutheran denomination. And there was this synod and that synod, but I tabulated them all. I actually have this all in something called a pencil that I used. Have you heard of this? And I used to write all this stuff out, and this is what I come up with as the predecessors of these 7 or 9 denominations. Now, I would like to include AME and CME churches. You see that I've given them there in gray type. But if you look, you will see that the CME church only has statistics available as of 2000, and it's a very suspiciously round number of 800,000. So I'm just not quite convinced that's comparable to the statistics that I have from other churches. If you see, AME has what looks like credible statistics from 1925 and 1950, but interestingly, when they get to 1975 and 2000, it gets to be increasingly round numbers there. So I'm not quite convinced. And yet one of the problems is that on some of the tables that I'm going to show you, the tables actually do include the statistics from AME and CME churches, which they really shouldn't include because it skews, they're not comparable, I think, to the other ones. And so I'm still working on this material. But you see the basic groups I've included there: American Baptist Churches, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, for whom I do have very good statistics, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church in the USA, the ELCA, PCUSA, Reformed Church in America. That's another Reformed denomination. You probably know that's the inheritors of the Dutch Reformed groups, and that they split roughly mainline evangelical. So the Christian Reformed Church, or CRC, would be the more evangelical side of that, and the American Reformed Church in America, RCA, is the more mainstream church that came from that group. Rather small if you see the numbers there. Then the United Church of Christ and the United Methodist Church. Now, I've given totals at the bottom for each of those years, and I've given the U.S. population for each of those years. So you see that these groups represented 16% of the U.S. population in 1925, 16.8% of the United States population in 1950, 13% of the United States population in 1975, and then 8.7% of the U.S. population as of 2000. Now, some big things going on in terms of stats that will explain some of that loss of percentage of the U.S. population. Basically, it's going to be the changing ethnic groups that came to the United States at the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, which tended to be Catholic, Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox groups, and then the changes as a result of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 that have brought a much broader group of people, many of them non-Christian and not traditionally Jewish or Muslim people, to the United States since that time. Now then, what are we looking at in terms of the statistics that Dean Kelly tracked? Well, here is my slide showing basically what he was looking at, though I think it's a little skewed because if I understand it right, the figures that I've given you there include the AME and CME churches, and if so, then it's a little artificially high at the end, and it really ought to drop off a little more than you've got there. But you see in 1975, the total membership of these groups, about 29.9, or right at 30 million in the U.S., and total membership around 2000, somewhere around 27.8. That's basically the kind of figures that Kelly was looking at. I think one of the things that people supposed, and this I think is perhaps the most misleading thing about these statistics, but what a lot of people supposed is that you could carry out that decline into the past. which leads to what I call the fantasy horror scenario that's on the next slide that I'll give you. Now, on the printout that you've got, the fantasy or horror membership figures are the ones in the gray line, and the actual membership figures are the ones in the blue lines here, representing the predecessors of these 9 denominations. The horror figure would be if you sort of suppose that mainline churches really were at one time the main body of American Christians, and all I've done to get that, since it's a fantasy, I can do whatever I want. But this is like a field day for historians. An historian, you just sit there thinking when you're writing something, oh man, if I could just make up 2 facts here, I could just have such a better story. But novelists get to do that, and most historians don't have the luxury of making up facts. But here I can make up facts because I've admitted this is a horror scenario. So all I've done is I've just carried out the ratio of decline into the past, and that would mean a rather steep line of decline. But in fact, if you see the blue line that I've given in the chart, I think it's the 3rd page of material that you've received, it's a very, very different scenario than what I think a lot of people imagined. And what you see there is that the overall membership of these churches in 1925 was around 19 million. In 1950, it's 26.5 million. In 1975, it's 29.9, as we saw before, and in 2000, it's 27.8 million, which is to say that the overall membership of these 9 denominations was actually much stronger in 2000 than it was in 1925. See, there's been a pattern of growth. If you look at it over that period, there's really what you might call a hump at the middle of the 20th century. I'm going to ask you to be thinking about what might account for a hump in the membership of churches. Now, remember, this is membership of the churches. We're not talking about disciples of Jesus Christ. We're not talking about people who go to church. We're not talking about people who receive the Lord's Supper, people who go to hear sermons or read the Bible or pray. We're just talking about people who have their names on the rolls of churches. Why would there be that kind of hump in membership at the middle of the 20th century? As you think about that, we're going to look at some further statistical material. I think I've got one more tabulation for you. Well, I've got it for you, but not in the material that you've got. What I've got is some United Methodist stuff, and I want to ask you if this is anything like your experience as Lutherans. Now, Bishop Kevin is helping me get in touch with the Lutheran folks who keep the statistics, and I'm also in touch with Presbyterians, so I'm hoping I'll be able to present comparable statistical figures for a lot of these denominations. But here's what I know about my own church. In 1976, if you see, and again, I don't have this page shown on the slides here. 1976, our membership was right at 10 million. And in 2010, our membership was about 7.6 million. So it's a fairly steep decline that I think kind of echoes that overall decline in old line or mainline churches in the United States. If you look at the figures for worship attendance, then you will find that it's a very different sort of thing. It's a decline, actually, though you'll see there's actually a rise at one point and then a decline further along. The worship attendance was 3.6 million in 1976. The average weekly worship attendance in 2010 is right at 3 million members. So you've got a decline, and since 2004, there's an even more noticeable little decline, if you see that. I mean, it's not as impressive as the overall decline. Now, you might look at that and say, okay, that represents active membership in churches, but actually only if you think that active members come once a week. And I'm going to be asking you to exercise your pastoral judgment here as to whether that's what's really happening in your churches. It certainly was when I grew up in Beaumont, Texas in the 1950s. We were members of a church, and that meant we went every week. Saturday night you polished your shoes, and Sunday morning you went to Sunday school at 9:45, and you went to church at 11 o'clock, and at noon you went to Grandma's house for lunch, and then you played with your cousins in the afternoon, and then you went to the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and you went to the evening church service. Oh my students have no idea what I'm talking about now when I describe these things. And then you went home to watch Candid Camera and Bonanza and whatever else came on Sunday evenings. That is now a fantasy, okay? But the idea of counting the average weekly attendance as counting the actual membership of the churches is problematic. So I want you to turn to what is not quite a fantasy, but the next page of statistics you have. And my apologies to those watching by the podcast or the simulcast, because you don't have this one to look at. But what I've tried to show here is the blue line is membership, and that's actually the lay membership in the United Methodist Church. In the United Methodist Church, we count clergy as members of the annual conference. They're pretty good at attending church, generally, as I hear. But the green line at the bottom is the line you saw that was blue earlier about actual worship attendance. And then the red line is what I'm guessing to be something like the active membership of congregations defined as those who attend once a month. Because the phenomenon that pastors tell me about, and that I observe very clearly in the Sunday school class that I teach every week at Lovers Lane United Methodist Church, is that in the 1950s, if people came to church every Sunday unless they were desperately ill, today very active United Methodists come once or twice a month. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, one is the fact that you got kids' sports on Sunday, right? I mean, you got soccer games on Sunday morning. That would have been atrocious even 30 years ago when we first heard about this when we were living in Maryland. We could not imagine that they would put kids' soccer games on Sunday morning. That's a reality now. All kinds of sporting events and children's events go on Sunday mornings. People have homes away from home, and I would love to believe that when they go to their vacation homes, they go to the local Lutheran church or United Methodist church there, but I don't think so. I think they sleep in when they get to their vacation homes. And just the general cultural phenomenon of staying home on Sunday mornings is very strong. You can see that in a Norman Rockwell print, one of my very favorite ones. I should put it in this presentation because it's one of his prints from the 1950s or early 60s, and it shows this very modern living room, the mama dressed up to go to church with her prim little hat on, all the kids lined up like ducklings, the father in his bathrobe reading the newspaper, sort of grim, and the mother is kind of grimacing at the father, and the father's grimacing at the mother, and the youngest son is looking longingly at the father, like, when I grow up, that's what I'm going to do on Sunday mornings. I think there's just a kind of cultural thing that's going on that's part of it. What United Methodist clergy tell me, and a few Presbyterians, is that in their best guess scenario, back in the 1950s and 60s, maybe even into the 70s, the active membership of a congregation, now meaning who came once a month or so, was probably 10 or 15% above the average weekly worship attendance. And now the average, the active membership is about 30 to 40% above the average weekly worship attendance. Does that make sense to you? Do you see what I'm talking about there? In other words, if you took your average attendance every week and then you asked how many people are actually coming once a month or so, it's going to obviously be a higher figure than that. I mean, it was higher back in the 60s when somebody got sick and they didn't come on that Sunday morning, but now it's a much higher figure than that. So my red line on that page is my attempt to just give a curve from about 15% in 1976 to about 30% in 2010. I think, if anything, I'm estimating conservatively, and Bishop Kevin, this is a new development since I gave that talk in the Louisiana Interchurch Council. But when we have our discussion time, I would love to hear from you if you think something like that phenomenon is happening in ELCA congregations in the United States. I certainly need to know if it's not happening, because I'm guessing that something like that is a parallel phenomenon. Okay, the case that I'm trying to make then, if it's not perfectly clear, is that there is a core of people who are committed members of our churches, and that core is not declining at anything like the rate at which the overall membership of the church is declining. Now we're going to ask some of the questions about why that might be. And first of all, some of the problems with membership statistics. In the first place, you know that there is no doubt that membership in mainline denominations has declined. As I say, if you expected me to say something else than that, sorry to deliver the bad news, but yes, it is true. Membership, overall membership, in terms of people who claim they are members of churches or names that we have on our church rolls, that number is consistently declining. We also know, though, that membership is not an accurate reflection of church activity or of church commitment, especially in the mid-20th century, when church membership, but not church activity, was socially expected. So two things about the mid-20th century bulge in mainline church membership. Two or three things. Number one, my student Diana Butler Bass, whom I taught at Duke Divinity School, Diana was looking at Episcopal church statistics, and she found a very similar bulge, and her principal explanation was that in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, to be anybody in a traditional community in the United States, you had to have your name on the roll of a church. It was just socially expected that you had your name on the roll of a church. If you were not declared to be a Catholic or a atheist or a Jew or something else, you were expected to have your name on the roll of a Protestant church. And you expected, it was kind of a contract. You might give a very nominal contribution every now and then, but you gave your church a little bit of money, and you expected them to perform weddings and funerals, basic hatching, matching, dispatching functions we talk about in the theological school, without honorarium. Do you remember that? Back when you didn't get honorariums for performing weddings, because it was expected that was kind of what you were paying with your dues with your church membership, right? Some religious groups still operate like that. You know, you pay a set of dues, and you expect then that the rabbi or the pastor or whatever will be present for these events without honorarium. Now, needless to say, and Diana's research was basically showing for Episcopalians, I think she's dead right for United Methodists as well, that social expectation is no longer there. You no longer are expected to say that you have your name on the roll of a church anywhere. That meant that at the middle of the 20th century, if not before, maybe before, but it's certainly at the middle of the 20th century, we were carrying on the rolls of our churches an enormous, what I would call a fluff membership. That is to say, a group of people who had no intention of attending church, very little intention of supporting the church except a nominal contribution from year to year, and who did not show any outward or visible marks of Christian discipleship. But they had their names on the rolls of the churches. Now, folks, that's what Kelly was looking at. That's what people are saying when they say mainline churches are declining. They're absolutely correct, and it has almost nothing to do with activity in churches, outward marks of Christian discipleship, and so forth. So you've got to make an enormously clear distinction about what's being actually counted. Okay, that's one thing, the social expectation that your name would be on the roll of a church. Second thing, this was the high water mark for the status, the social status of old line or mainline churches. This is the time when to be mainline was valued very, very positively. Needless to say, that status of that particular term and that particular group of churches has caused kind of lost cultural significance since then, which is to say people are happy having their names on the roll of some other churches. Interestingly, one of the things we know is that evangelical megachurches now have a similar phenomenon of the fluff membership. That is to say, they're carrying a lot of people on their rolls who don't come very often, and they think it's part of their evangelistic mission to keep them there and try to evangelize them. But, for example, you've heard of Willow Creek Community Church. What I understand is that their Sunday morning events are almost entirely designed for people who are not traditionally religious, right? You walk in and you see the food court, right? Because the food court is friendly. It looks like a shopping mall. You feel at home there. It's all designed to make not traditionally religious people feel comfortable. Their Wednesday evening services are much more designed for their core membership, which is a much smaller group. So there's a kind of parallel phenomenon there that's worth looking at. But I think the 1950s were probably the high water mark for the cultural cachet, you might say, of mainline, old line denominations. And we can lament that passing, but that's past, I think. That's gone. The third thing that we might say about the membership bulge in the mid-20th century is simply the extraordinary quality of that generation of leaders, that what we came to call the greatest generation. You know, Tom Brokaw's term for my parents' generation who went through the Depression and then the Second World War. And what those two historical phenomena taught that group of people was, you got to do things together. It matters. You hang around together. So for that generation, this is the way it looked in United Methodist churches, and I would guess it was similar for Lutherans. If you had a potluck, a covered dish supper, a church dinner, and that generation was in leadership, they were all going to be there. And typically they were going to be there 45 minutes ahead of the event starting, and they were going to be there for an hour after, and all of them stayed until the last dish was washed. Not that the men ever washed any dishes, just that they hung around with each other and their friends talking about sports or something while their wives were cleaning up. But that idea, I mean, my students cannot even conceive of something like that, the idea that everyone would feel like they need to come. It was a joiner generation, a generation in which social clubs and organizations were absolutely thriving, and I think the unique culture of that generation is partly to explain that rise in membership in the mid-20th century. Another fact I would mention is that even average weekly worship attendance has shown a parallel but significantly smaller decline in the same period. So again, if we're trying to estimate actual church activity, it's not going to follow the steep decline of membership, nor even quite the less steep decline of worship attendance. It's going to be somewhere in a different category than that. And as I've already said, in the last 40 years, average weekly worship attendance has diverged from active membership. And now it hath been revealed unto me why I didn't have those statistical tables in the right place. That's because this is where I actually put them in my presentation, so the folks who are watching in the simulcast can get a little sense of this is my chart of United Methodist membership versus, in the red line at the bottom, average weekly worship attendance. By the way, while you're looking at that, we used to say average worship at the principal weekly worship service, which is very misleading now, because, for example, at Highland Park United Methodist Church, which I have attended for many, many years in my life, that church in 1984 had 3 Sunday morning services, all of them well attended, and I can tell you that Tom Landry came to the 9:30 service, except when the Cowboys had a home game, and then he came to the 8:30 service. But, you know, all of them well attended, and at that point they were only reporting one worship service as their principal weekly attendance. Now, I go back to Highland Park after 22 years away from Dallas, when we came back in 2006, that church has 7 or 8 services every Sunday morning, one in the contemporary Christian mode, one in the contemporary gospel mode, one in what they bill as the Methodist Anglican tradition, sort of a high church service in one of the chapels there. Sort of different strokes for different folks, whereas in the 22 years before, every service was a cookie-cutter copy. But now we've kind of acknowledged that, and we aggregate all attendance on Sunday morning together. So that itself could skew the figures. But now I'm showing the folks on the simulcast can see the figure that shows what I estimate to be in that center red line, something more like the active membership of the churches. And what I hope you see is that is not at all as sharp a decline as you might predict based on either actual membership in the churches or weekly worship attendance. Okay, so sorry about getting those in the wrong spaces there. Now let's look at some big picture contextual factors that I think are important to look at, and this is where I become my historian self and where you're in great danger, because I can talk about this stuff for the rest of the day. One of the big factors now is that growth in the United States population from the 1890s forward was largely from non-Protestant context. So if the United States was principally Protestant up to the time of the Civil War and maybe 20 years or so beyond the Civil War, maybe through the 1870s, I think we would all say that from the 1880s through the 1930s and 40s, the growth of the United States population was from places like Central and Eastern Europe, from Italy and Ireland, where the largest religious groups coming in were Catholic, Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox Christian groups. Not the kind of groups that would feed traditional Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, and other communities. You may know that this led to a couple of interesting backlashes in U.S. history in this period. One thing was that in the 1920s there was a renewed Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan originally came about after the Civil War with the intent of terrorizing African American people in response to Reconstruction in the South. But in the 1920s, the newly revived Ku Klux Klan was not only anti-black, it was anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic as well, all of whom were depicted as not really Americans. I mean, their idea was white Protestants are really Americans, meaning USA folks, and these other groups, the new immigrant groups, were kind of alien to American culture. Now, I know this is not true for Lutherans, but the way this played out for Methodists and Baptists in the South came down to the presidential election of 1928. Anybody know about the presidential election of 1928, which pitted the dry Republican Herbert Hoover against the wet Democrat Alfred Emanuel Smith. And Methodists and Baptists in the South had an enormous problem because, first of all, everybody was a Democrat in the South, right? I mean, almost everyone. Actually, African Americans at that period tended to be Republicans. Interesting, another sort of switch that's going to go on later on. But everybody in the solid South, as they called it, was Democrats. But how could Democrats in the South, especially Methodists and Baptists, support the son of a Catholic immigrant who was Catholic himself and who openly touted the fact that he drank alcoholic beverages? It was just unthinkable. Now, Methodists and Baptists in the South also found it unthinkable to identify themselves as Republicans. So what they did was to create blocks of anti-Smith Democrats who actually went and voted for Herbert Hoover in the 1928 elections. But it shows you how in that period the Catholics, and it would have been even more true for Jews and maybe for Eastern Orthodox Christians, were simply seen as not being part of the mainstream of American life at that time. But that was the new immigrant groups moving into the United States from that period. They're not contributing much to the growth of traditional Protestant or Anglican churches, if you don't consider Anglicans to be. I have a problem when I speak to Episcopalian groups because I'll say Protestant, and they'll immediately jump up and say, oh, we're not Protestant, and so forth. I like to point out to them, if you go to the Virginia telephone book and you look up the telephone number of the Theological Seminary in Alexandria, it's under P in the phone book, even though they never mention that fact. Right. So from that period, in 1965, in the summer of 1965, I happened to be in Washington, D.C., and in that summer, Lyndon Johnson managed to get passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Now, that has had an enormous influence on immigration to the United States since that time, because despite the fact that non-Protestant groups were coming from the 1880s and 1890s, the U.S. immigration policy had been almost explicitly racist up to 1965. That is to say, it still favored light-skinned European people as the immigrants to the United States throughout that long period. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 formally changed that by opening immigration to lots more African people than had come to the United States in the past, lots more Asian people that had come to the United States in the past, and that has had an effect on the life of our churches. One of the effects that it's had is that a lot of non-Christian people have come to the United States, and maybe even more importantly than the numbers themselves, non-Christian people have become a lot more visible in the United States since this period. Now, that's an important distinction to make because there have always been Jews in the United States. In Beaumont, Texas, where I'm from, there was a very strong Jewish community from early in the 20th century. We like to point out we were a port city. We had international folk. We had Eastern Orthodox Christians in Beaumont, from the time of the oil boom in the early 20th century there and so forth. They were not very visible in American culture, but the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 led to greater visibility. Now, I want to recommend a book to you and then give you a warning about it. There's a book that came out about 13 years ago called A New Religious America by a woman named Diana Eck. Very much discussed book, a very good book, I think, in many ways. The picture that she paints is that as a result of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, the United States has become much more religiously diverse and much more conscious of its religious diversity. One of the interesting things about this book, though, is it's very short on statistics. Where are the facts? How many Muslims are there? How many Jews are there? How many Hindus are there? When I started looking into it, and again, this database that I used for the figures that I gave earlier was very helpful in looking up figures, what I found was that the actual number of people who identify themselves as Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and so forth, really not gone up very much in the United States. I think the phenomenon she points to that's much more true and obvious is the fact that people are much more aware of people of other religious faiths than they were in the past. Certainly my daughter's generation, my daughters are identifiably, I have a daughter who's 27 and a daughter who's 30. They are both part of what we sometimes call the millennial generation. They grew up with lots and lots of friends who are either not from Christian groups like Buddhists or Muslims or Hindus and so forth, or they have lots and lots of friends who are just not religious at all. And so, not surprisingly, that generation has a much higher people who identify themselves in religious surveys as none, meaning N-O-N-E. Not nuns. We often talk about the nuns, but people imagine Sally Field flying around in her nun's habit. But we're talking about those who have no religious affiliation. Now, here's something to think about. Here's my take on the nuns. I think it's very much a result of this phenomenon since 1965. Back in the 1960s, there was a group of inactive church members, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, whatever. And today there's a similarly large group of nuns. Now here's the difference. You watching? The inactive church members back then did not regularly attend church. They did not regularly give to church, and they showed very few marks of outward Christian discipleship. The nuns today do not regularly go to church. They do not regularly contribute to churches, and they do not show many outward marks of Christian affiliation. Do you see the difference between them? There's not much, okay, except for this, that the nuns are actually a little more honest than the inactive Methodist, Lutherans, and Presbyterians 40 years ago. I really think so. I think they're just a little more honest. I mean, they were there. They were on the rolls of our churches 40 years ago. They were not contributing. They're the loveliest people in the world, by the way, the new nuns and the old inactive members. My pastor set me a wonderful exercise in the summer of 1976, a very hot summer in Pasadena, Texas, where I was assistant pastor at Sunset United Methodist Church. He got the church secretary to go through the rolls and find names of people who had not attended more than once a year for the last 5 years. And I spent that summer visiting these lovely, lovely people, the nicest people you ever met, who had absolutely no intention of coming to church. I was just shocked. I mean, I grew up in this totally attending home, where my parents were that World War II generation and so forth. Just presumed everybody else in the world was kind of like that. And lo and behold, it turns out that there's a very different range of people. They were Methodists then. They were listed in the rolls of United Methodist churches. Increasingly, that generation is dying off. A lot of the membership that we're losing in those steep membership declines is that generation dying off. And they're being replaced by folks whose parents were United Methodists and ELCA, but who don't identify themselves as members of a religious group. And that raises the issue that's simply the biggest picture, and that is the continued growth of secular outlooks in Western cultures since the 1700s, really since the time of the Enlightenment, that's continued to affect traditional religious institutions in the United States and elsewhere. Now, 30 years ago, when I was in Oxford, they were saying that there was a big difference between Britain and the United States in this respect. Because, well, as it was put by, do you know the theologian John Macquarie? John Macquarie is a Scottish Episcopalian theologian, and his book called Principles of Christian Theology was the standard systematic theology textbook they were using at Perkins back in the 1980s. John Macquarie gave a lecture one time that interested us a great deal because we had just gone to England from Houston, and he referred to Houston in this comment. He said, I can try to imitate his Scots accent, but he said, the city of Houston, it's actually the way he said it, the city of Houston, Texas, he said, it's a very interesting place because half of the population goes to church on Sunday. Now, we knew this was not true. I mean, we're just sitting there grinning. I mean, even in the 1970s, we knew it was no more than 35% of the population of Houston that might have gone to church on Sunday morning. And he was contrasting this with the fact that even at that time, only 2 to 2.5% of the British population actually attended church, actually went to church on any given Sunday morning. And he played that out for a while, what looks like a big difference between the United States and Britain. Then he made this really insightful comment. He said what it looked like to him was that the secular culture had actually come into the churches in the United States, so that he was seeing the beginnings of popular performance cultures coming into churches and influencing Christian worship, so that church didn't look a lot different from the kind of performance venues and performance cultures that were going on in the culture at large. I thought that was very insightful. But what's happened is that since his time, that gap between Britain and the United States, or you might say between Europe and the United States, has begun to decline or to lessen. That is to say, overall religious attendance, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, evangelical even in the United States has begun to decline in recent decades. So I asked the question, who are the nuns? I've already dealt with that along the way. One of the big questions that's been asked is whether evangelical churches, now you know, again, Lutherans, I'm using this in the sense of evangelical, pietistic or conversionist evangelical churches, whether the evangelical churches have eclipsed us all. Large evangelical churches, often identified as mega churches with minimal denominational branding, have been seen as usurping the place of mainline churches. I'm going to say two things about this. The first one I don't have a bullet point about, but one of the things that we know from ecumenical work, I was part of National Council of Churches Faith and Order work in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and we had a specific project relating our churches to mega churches, and we visited several mega churches. And one of the things we discovered very rapidly is that most of the evangelical mega churches have what we called a stealth denominational identity. That is to say, once you got to know the culture of that church, it became very clear that the leading pastor had come out of a particular tradition, a way of being Christian, and the church continued to reflect that, even though they typically cut denominational ties. So Rick Warren, Southern Baptist, builds a congregation with a lot of former Baptists on his staff. The congregation's structure is structured similar to a traditional Baptist church. They don't call it a board of deacons. I think they have a different structure that they call it, but it functions like that. They don't baptize infants. They baptize believers only. They have a doctrinal statement that could read as a Baptist doctrinal statement. Willow Creek Community Church, South Barrington, Illinois, founding pastor, part of the evangelical free denomination in the United States. That's something that came out of Scandinavian Lutheranism and pietistic movements within Lutheranism. Their leading theological school is Trinity Evangelical Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois. Most of their leaders at Willow Creek have been trained at Trinity Evangelical. They tend to reflect the traditions of that particular denomination and that style of what had been Lutheran pietism and so forth. So one thing, you can find a stealth denomination. We were looking for this, a group of us from NCCC actually, were visiting a mega church in Louisville, Kentucky. I think it was called Southside Christian Church, and it sounded pretty generic. So the game we were playing as the church folk there were showing us the church. They're pointing out 30,000 people worship every week in this congregation, multiple services all day long. And you could see the light bulbs go on over our heads when the guide said, one of our laymen in this congregation, they said, is an engineer, and he invented a machine that can squirt 3,000 communion cups per minute so that we can have communion at every service. Bing! Suddenly we realized it's a stealth Disciples of Christ congregation. And in fact, the pastor had come from, the founding pastor had come from the Disciples of Christ denomination. So the rumor that these are non-denominational churches is pretty much that. They have sublimated the name of the denomination, just as I said, Methodists and Baptists and others sometimes do these days. But there is a recognizable tradition of Christian formation that is associated with these churches. The other thing that I will make a bullet point about is that if you look at a recent book by a Duke University sociologist named Mark Chaves, American Religion Contemporary Trends, published by Princeton University Press in 2011, Mark has a chapter on the question of whether people are leaving mainline churches to go over to evangelical churches, especially those of the new evangelical sort, the kind of contemporary Christian model. And what he finds is that there's very, very little evidence of that. There are, of course, a few cases, but a lot of people read the statistics about mainline decline. They hear that mega churches are growing, they just presume that people are leaving A and going to B. But he says it's actually not happening. And what's really happening is that, to their great credit, the evangelical churches are basically growing from the nuns, the people who are not religiously declared, and other evangelicals who are playing the congregation jumping game, sort of going from here to there and whatever is the cool place this month to be in a particular church. The other thing I would say, I think, is very significant now. Mega churches now face significant issues with transitions from their founding pastors. And the greatest example I know of this is Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral. If you haven't heard what's going on there in the last 3 years, you really need to know about it. And in fact, one of the organists at our church gave me her copy of a magazine called The American Scholar, Winter 2014. I can't subscribe to this magazine because it's for Phi Beta Kappa people, okay? Not me. Actually, I was a member of Phi Theta Kappa. That was the junior college equivalent of it. I'm not making this up. When I was at North Texas, we were considered to be such a low-class university, we weren't allowed to have a Phi Beta Kappa chapter. I was part of some other Greek letter thing that they had for those of us who were making fairly good grades. But in any case, she's Phi Beta Kappa. And the cover story is called The Empty Cathedral, Why Evangelical Christianity is Going the Way of the Drive-In Movie Theater. Now, in some ways, it's a badly constructed article, and if I were writing a review of it, I'd take it apart in a couple of ways. But she focuses on Robert Schuller's fabulous Crystal Cathedral. If you've not seen this, I mean, it is really worth seeing. Designed by Philip Johnson. You probably have seen him preaching there in the old broadcasts that they had. Tremendous growth. You may know he started out with this interesting evangelical model of using an actually using an active drive-in theater as his first home for this congregation. And so people pull up in their cars and listen to a sermon and so forth. And then he built this fabulous church congregation. Well, I saw him about 5 years ago. He was at a meeting of theological educators and administrators, and he was a very angry old man. I couldn't figure out what was going on. He was basically saying, haven't I shown you how to build a big congregation, and none of you theological schools have taken me seriously or looked at our model of how to build a congregation? Well, the interesting thing is just a couple of years after that, he stepped down as the senior pastor. He tried to appoint his son to follow him. Membership starts declining rapidly, immediately. Thinks, well, maybe the problem is his son. He actually appointed his daughter then to replace him. Evangelicals don't work well in dynasties, by the way. Didn't work well with Oral Roberts also up in Tulsa. And really what happened was that after just a year or two after he stepped down, that congregation still exists, but they had to sell the Crystal Cathedral. Guess who they sold it to? They sold it to the Catholics, that's right. The Catholic Archdiocese now owns it and is in process of converting it into a Catholic cathedral or co-cathedral. There's a parable for you about American religion. Now, the area where I might criticize this is, first of all, she says the empty cathedral. If anybody knows evangelical culture, cathedral is not the right word to talk about evangelical groups. Except, I would say, my parents belonged to a congregation in Beaumont, Texas, that was a congregation of the Assemblies of God, and they tried very hard to avoid anything that said Assemblies of God or Pentecostal. They called their church Cathedral in the Pines Christian Center. And a very progressive pastor, who I thought was a very cool guy, actually. His son fell from grace and is now a United Methodist theologian. We can blame it on Moltmann, because he went to Tübingen and studied with Moltmann, came back to the United States, became United Methodist, and so forth. But their congregation is kind of interesting for Pentecostals, because they had a printed order of service. If you ask them, what is your doctrine, what do you believe, they handed you the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed with the Filioque clause in it. And they had a printed order of service, and the Holy Ghost causes you to speak in tongues right here. Very, very specific place, kind of scripted, liturgical-looking congregation. But cathedral, this is somebody who doesn't really know the culture of evangelical churches. The other thing is that although Schuller really did set the model for mega churches, he didn't follow the contemporary Christian cultural model. That is to say, his worship, if you know, was much more traditional. Organ music, traditional hymns, and so on and so forth. I mean, what Robert Schuller really did as a kind of interim step was that he kind of gave a long introduction to everything they did, right? He'd say, now we're going to sing a hymn, and it's a hymn, but you got this log. Please get over. I grew up with this stuff, so I'm thinking, please get over the lecture and just let me sing the hymn, okay? But everything had this kind of preface to it for non-church friendly people. The one thing, though, that this article points out that I think is the kernel of very interesting material is that recent studies funded by the Lilly Institute and the Pew Research Fund really have shown for the first time a decline in evangelical church membership and participation in the last 5 to 10 years. That's kind of surprising because, again, the image that's out there in the culture is those churches are growing, our churches are declining. I think they're going to have to face a question in the future. Now, this is my perspective as a historian. My perspective is that when new groups arise within Protestant circles, I'm not going to say, within Catholic circles, you can have a new group arises and they end up forming a religious order that doesn't separate. But Protestants just tend to separate, right? And when a new group arises, in the first generation or two of their leadership, they are passionately concerned to show why they are not like other churches. And then what I find is they typically begin to knit themselves back into the body of other churches. Methodists are a good example of that. When we originated, we were very different than other churches, very distinctive, and we have begun to look like other churches. And in my opinion, that's not an entirely bad thing. Seventh-day Adventists are an interesting example. When they originated, they had doctrinal statements that really dissed, and this is a technical theological word, they kind of dissed the traditional doctrine of the Trinity. And yet they were kind of reformed later in the 19th century by a woman who had been Methodist, right, Ellen G. White, and they came out with a much more traditional Christology and a much more traditional statement of their Trinitarian beliefs, even though using just scriptural language. So they show what I sometimes say is that in the origins of a religious movement, there's a centrifugal tendency, a tendency to flee from the center, to make themselves look different. And then in the third to fourth generation, you begin to see a centripetal tendency, sort of falling toward the middle and beginning to look like other churches. Now, again, I say that's not necessarily a bad thing. Protestantism actually grows from that kind of accordion effect of going out and coming back in. But what I think the contemporary megachurches are going to face in the near future is either the scenario of the Crystal Cathedral, if they have not put in place institutions, and it takes institutions to transmit a culture beyond one generation. See, what I'd say Robert Schuller didn't do, he didn't transmit a culture beyond his generation. Either they simply decline as a result of losing their founding pastor, or they succeed in putting in place institutions that do transmit cultures, and in that case, guess what? They start looking much more mainline. They start looking much more mainstream, because in a sense, that's what overall kind of defines old line or mainline churches in the United States and elsewhere. So folks, what I'm working on, and I'll conclude this section and then invite some discussion before our lunch, I'm going to offer some sober encouragement, not crazy, wild, God is in the resurrection business, everything's looking up and so forth. I can't really give you that kind of good news today, but some sober encouragement. Sober because there's absolutely no question about the decline not only of mainline churches, but of religious institutions of all sorts of traditional religious institutions in the United States. We're seeing that now with evangelical groups, but it's been a process that's been ongoing since the 1700s or so. It's not surprising to anyone who knows what's going on, but there's just no doubt about the overall decline. I think, though, that the focus on overall church membership is faulty for all of the reasons that I've been giving you in this part of the lecture. The misleading idea that it reflects active membership, which it does not do, the ways in which membership can be skewed by things like those mid-20th century phenomena that we looked at, and so forth. I think one of the things that it points to is we actually need better statistics. I think we ought to be tracking how many people come once a month. I think that statistic would help us, and especially if we get that across denominational lines, I think that would help us a lot more with knowing more about the actual state and vitality of congregations. But the bottom line for me is that I think there remains a very strong core of committed Christians in mainline churches. Almost all of us who are participants in these churches know that that's the case. We see it every week in our congregations. We see people doggedly hanging in there, keeping the faith, handing it on to new generations. I'm going to say several things about the strengths of these churches in the next section. If I can go on long enough, I'll avoid the fourth section, as I say. But sisters and brothers, I would say we should be encouraged, but soberly or realistically encouraged about evidence of resilience, evidence of a strong core of active membership in our churches. And that's going to lead me to go on in the next section to talk about our strengths. But does this make sense to you? I gave you a bunch of United Methodist figures there, and wonder if that, I mean, there are real differences between ELCA cultures and United Methodist and other mainline cultures. So I wonder if that works out in your context, or if what I'm seeing is maybe distinctive, or how does that strike you? I mean, overall, what I'm looking for is the sense of a solid core of committed membership in congregations, which I see. I think I see that across the board, but you may have thoughts on membership and so forth. Yes, ma'am.
We have an inactive tracking that starts showing when a person has missed 3 weeks in a row, and it's amazing how many of those do go off the next week because they come back in 4 weeks. And it's been difficult encouraging my church that this is a part of our environment, this is a part of our social piece of America right now, that it is once a month or once every 3 weeks. We still, after 3 weeks, we send out a message, because the other flip side of that is that we've heard that when someone is gone 1 week, they're sick, 2 weeks, they say, well, you know, nobody's called in 3 weeks. It's like, well, nobody cares, and they don't come back. So it's an area that's very, can you actually wait until a month to say that person is really still active, just very active elsewhere too?
Right. Okay. That makes good sense to me, and we certainly see that kind of phenomenon in the UMC. I'm glad that's your congregation that's tracking it like that. Yeah. Presbyterian Church USA has a statistic on active and inactive membership, but they define inactive members as those who only come once a year. So if you actually show up at Christmas and Easter, they consider you to be an active member of the congregation. I don't think that quite does what I'm trying to accomplish here, but I'd say once a month or so might be an indication that you have more of a consistent intention to be part of the community. Hold on just a second. We're going to get you a microphone there.
I know Messiah, and I presume that, I think it's in the standard model of the ELCA Congregational Constitution, an active member is defined as somebody who's given an offering of record or attended Holy Communion at least once during the previous year.
Okay, so that would really answer to the PCUSA way of defining it. Yours is a little more technically refined, and I kind of like that. But what I mean by active membership is a little slightly different than that. Yeah.
So I don't know if it would be, churches, in order to get good data in the LCA, churches would have to kind of have in mind something that is not actually part of their constitution as just something, a way of record keeping.
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I have to say, one of the things that I debate about whether I should say this in this book, because I'm intending the book to encourage folks in mainline churches, give them a little bit of stuff to think about. But one of the things that we all know is how the stats get cooked. And sometimes I think I'd rather not people outside of our churches know about how the statistics get cooked. But for example, one of the games we play in the United Methodist Church is we actually try to remove people from church rolls because our what we call apportionments and Presbyterians call church taxes are partly calculated on the basis of the actual membership figures you give, and sometimes weekly attendance figures. And then also, we cook the books sometimes in terms of budgets, because we've added budgets as a way of calculating how much money you ought to be giving to the denomination. So we got a lot of little United Methodist churches that have a cemetery next door that has a separate cemetery association, and honestly, they're using it as a money laundering operation. They're running a lot of their church budget through the cemetery association so they don't have to show it. But interestingly, in those cases, it would mean that our statistics are abnormally depressed. That is to say, they're actually lower than what you would actually be showing because you're trying to avoid paying those church taxes or apportionments. I think there's a, yeah.
Yep. I'm pastor for worship at one of our congregations in Plano, northern suburb, and we are definitely seeing the once a month kind of activity, or twice a month is probably our most. Our total Sunday morning number seems to be declining, but when we go through our statistics and pull out how many people are there twice a month, once a month, that number is actually increasing a little bit. It's a really odd place because we're, as pastor for worship, I'm kind of trying to talk some of this with our church council to say our membership, our active membership is actually growing,
Right.
even though our attendance on any given Sunday has dropped.
Right. I can believe that. Actually, if you could send me some of those stats, that would be very helpful. And similarly, the kind of things that you were mentioning would be helpful for me to see.
Well, actually, let me clarify that as a member for my church, indeed, it is communing, contributing once a year. What this is a ministry that we have for inactives, and it's the point that we first contact people is if they have been absent 3 times. Then we send out a card. We have a list of what we do at various times. When do I get in contact with them? When do other members, or do I know something, somebody's broken his leg, is going to be out for 6 weeks, that kind of thing. It's, but it is, the statistics are given to my council also, and they really get to see that just because our attendance is here doesn't mean that that's all the people that come.
Right.
The people that come are actually up here.
Yeah, that's that gap that I'm sort of pointing to, but very helpful to see there.
I'm encouraged by the nuns a little bit, particularly by the millennials, and maybe you could help with this. I think the researcher is Zigby, who looks at the millennials and says that they're much more sensitive to the needs of impoverished people, both in America and throughout the world, much more likely to have traveled to South America or to Africa. And I think that's because of the leavening effect of the church. That's my take on it. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I hope that's right, that it is the effect of the church. But everything I know confirms that. That is to say, my daughter's generation, they go out on work trips. They want to help people. That's what they really want to spend their time doing. And they're sometimes disaffected by traditional religious groups. Another thing that's mentioned in this American Scholar article, and I'd like to see the stats on it, but it's saying that one of the reasons for evangelical decline now is that the contemporary Christian model, which basically meant taking the performance culture of rock and hip-hop and punk music and so forth, and putting it in sort of Christian words and so forth, that appealed apparently to the later baby boomers and the X generation, but it's not appealing in nearly the same way to the millennials who, and now some people claim they actually favor more liturgical worship, and I've heard that. I would like to see the stats on that. Anybody's got that? By the way, my email address is tedc@smu.edu, tedc@smu.edu. If you can send me material like that you find, I'd like to see it. Is there? Yeah.
I just appreciate some of the things you've uncovered as far as the attendance, et cetera. I just want to make an observation, too. I wonder if part of that big bump in the 50s was anti-communism, the fact that communists were based on atheism, and so to demonstrate anti-communism was to be in church. And I wonder if now this kind of resurgence, as you noted in the recent Texas political campaigns, is a kind of anti-Muslim, forces against what internal forces now that are against the American ideal of free enterprise and capitalism. And I mean, I think there's a lot of that going on. And so people are coming to churches because they want, the churches they're often going to are churches who want to preserve that vision of America that they believe to be under attack
Right. Yes.
by the Muslims or internal candidates, liberals, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever their stripe is. I mean, I think that's going on too.
That makes a great deal of sense to me as a historian. We had a visiting scholar at SMU just in the last year. He's a Canadian who grew up in an evangelical church, but he's researching connections between evangelical churches, politics, and independent oil companies. And it's a very interesting thing. The case he makes is that the old line oil companies, Standard of Pennsylvania, Standard of New Jersey, Standard of New York, Saucony, and so forth, they tended to support old line churches, but the Wildcatters in Texas, the H.L. Hunt generation, the Clint Murkison generation, the Jock Ewing generation, of course. I mean, I'm going to include him right there with all the rest of them. That generation tended to be not attached to old line churches, mainline churches, and they tended to support Billy James Hargis and all these 1950s, 1960s, sometimes Billy Graham, and other kind of independent evangelical groups, and this is not so true with Billy Graham, but tended to blend it with right-wing conservative politics. So he's kind of giving a prehistory of what's going on in U.S. politics and conservative religion now. By the way, when we say evangelical churches were growing up until about 5 or 10 years ago, that doesn't mean fundamentalist churches. Fundamentalists have been in a fairly consistent decline since, the 1940s or so. And if you want to say, what's the difference? Well, fundamentalists, you tend to have a rather strict doctrine of scriptural inerrancy or infallibility, sort of anti-evolution, sort of some of the characteristics of you're describing as right-wing political views now, but it's a more generic kind of evangelical thing that has been flourishing, and as I say, we're beginning to see that tail off some. Yeah.
When we tried to restructure our roles a few years back, we met with great resistance to take anyone off of the membership, even though they hadn't been attending forever. They've moved out of the state. They never plan on ever coming back.
Right.
Because I can remember one of the members saying, well, what if they die and they want their funeral here?
Exactly. That's why they're there. That they expect us. The contract is if they're on the rolls of the church, you're going to perform their funeral, right? Yeah. I faced exactly that situation in my little congregation in Smith County, Texas. Smith County's where anybody from Tyler area? Okay, this was Winona, Texas, and then attached to it was something called the Center United Methodist Church. Not in Center, Texas, which is a big city compared to this. This is the center of Smith County. It was 12 elderly women who came every Sunday, and one male justice of the peace who showed up every now and then. Now, part of the fun was at this point, the United Methodist Church expected every congregation to have 37 officers. So Mrs. Culp, this is so stupid. Mrs. Culpepper had to be the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just the dumbest thing you can imagine. But it was a little tiny congregation, and they'd carried the membership number of 50 every year since whenever. And I looked back, and I felt terrible. I thought, they having 50 members, and they said 35 was the attendance in church every Sunday. And I show up, and I only see these 12 women, and I think, well, what am I doing so terribly wrong, you know? So, talking to Mrs. Culpepper one day, she was the leading person in the church, and Josephine Culpepper said, I said, Miss Culpepper, do we have a membership book somewhere? And she said, oh, Brother Campbell, Brother Smith had that book in his car, and he was in a car accident. And I think that book was lost then. I said, Miss Culpepper, when was that? She said, she grimaced and she said, I think that was 1937. They had not had a roll book for 40 years, even in the 1970s. So we went back and tried, as you say, to reconstruct the membership. We found 27 people on earth who ever remembered being a member of that church. And I will say here, since I'm on the record, with the permission of my superintendent, not all the way to the bishop, but the superintendent at least, we removed 23 anonymous names from the rolls of the... We didn't even know who we were removing, but just to get honest about it, we did it. But you're right. People don't want to have their names removed because that's the other factor in it, is they don't want to have their names removed because, right, they expect the pastor to preach their funeral, which, as you all know, would happen anyway, wouldn't it? If you had a constituent who had been part of your church, you would end up doing the funeral anyway, but somehow they think it's a contract that if you're a member of a church, you're going to get your funeral performed. Maybe one more, and then I think we're going to be very close to our lunchtime.
I think it's a miracle that we have young people coming to our church or this generation. And the reason, and to me, the reason to have such a strong core is to bring these newer members in. Because when you look what has happened to the American media and the media across the world, people do not feel like they need God.
Okay.
They don't need things in their lives because they have all of the electronic gadgets. All of the children have them. They have scheduled a lot of the ball games on Sunday. And you turn on the television and you listen to the media, and God has been replaced with all of these other more exciting things. So I think it's a miracle that we are where we are. And I thank God for the core people.
Yeah, that we've got. No, and they're very strong. And it kind of comes back around to what we were saying earlier about the image that religion has, and we all have to deal with that. You remember, no, I'm not going to say that. I say that to my students sometimes, and the answer is no, we don't remember that. But I'll say, I remember when missionaries were regarded as the greatest heroes you can imagine, these self-giving people who give up all the comforts of the world and go out to some place to bring Christianity and, Western civilization and electricity and all kinds of stuff. And now missionaries are regarded as the biggest heels who ever, really, their stock has gone down enormously. We could blame it on James Michener and his novel about Hawaii, I guess, but I think it's bigger than that. I think, missionaries are now seen as the lackeys of Western cultural imperialism, and it's a funny thing because every missionary I know has become almost a convert to native cultures. They come to see how beautiful the native culture is, and they try to convince people in the West of this, but they get painted as these culturally insensitive people cramming somebody else's culture down. So it's a huge problem we face across the board. Okay, and then Bishop, yes.
Good, Ted, thank you. Let's express our appreciation. It's good to have a Methodist among us who is bringing us this information. I find my heart strangely warmed by what you're telling us today. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm curious, maybe you can comment on this after lunch. Most of your statistics and charts take us through 2000. My observation is that the trend has accelerated mightily over the last 12 years, 14 years, and that the statistical numbers, I'm wondering if you would look at current statistics all the way across the board, if you would come to the same conclusions, although, again, your bottom line about the health of congregations, I think I affirm completely. So be interesting to see how that works. For example, the ELCA is now under 4 million in baptized members for the first time in 2012. We went to 3,970,000. We lose the equivalent. I'm looking at our trend report from the ELCA website. We lose the equivalent of about 3 synods the size of NTNL every year in terms of membership in the church, baptized members. Now, interestingly enough, the trend of percent of people who attend worship who are members of the church has stayed consistent or grown a little bit, not nationally so much. It's around 27% of our baptized members are what make up the average worship attendance, which are a lot of them are not baptized members, by the way. And I'll just affirm NTNL in this. Our number is, if I can pull it up, has actually grown over the last 10 years and is currently, as of in 2011, 41.58%. So we're 12, 13, 14 percentage points above the ELCA in worship attendance. One last statistic, though, I'd like to point out. We started counting 3 years ago active participants, and I'm trying to recall, because I don't do parochial reports, I don't fill them out. Is that number on your parochial report in addition to baptized members, or does it include? So now here's a statistic that I think is pretty amazing. In 2009, 9, 10, and 11, we counted overall 2.5 million active participants beyond baptized members in our churches. So if our baptized membership is around 3 million, but we're adding in 2.5 million participants that are active on top of that 3 million, we're back to the 5 million, which is where we were 30 years ago. So I think that says maybe more about us than some of the statistical trends. It's about the joiners and the non-joiners. There we go. Yeah, please. This is your show. You want to move the camera over to him rather than
it's
me?
okay. We'll get it. You probably saw the United Methodist statistics that I gave came down to 2010, and they do show actually in that last 2000 to 2010 a pretty consistent decline, pretty much like of overall membership. But the worship decline dropped off as of about 2004. And I've asked folks, what do you think about that? And their view is that really is the point at which the greatest generation were either dying or going into homes where they couldn't get back to their churches or something like that. But you're probably right about the continuation of the trend, maybe even sharper into the future.
My feeling is that it is, but then I don't have the statistics complete. It is in the ELCA. I think it's true in the ELCA. We're going to say grace and break. Kathy, you and
I was just going to say really quickly that also does not, I mean, there's no way for us to statistically keep track of people that engage us all over the world from the internet. I mean, I have a blog that has followers. I have people that listen to my podcast every week. And I have colleagues that are doing the same thing. And we haven't figured out a way to, sort of tally all those numbers yet either. But I think that it's something we have to at least start thinking about.
Very good. That's a helpful thought, too. Mm-hmm. All right, we're breaking for lunch with Grace here. We come back at 1:30. 1:30, we start at 1:30. You get a whole hour for lunch. We get till 3 then. Is that correct? Very good. And I do hope you get to part 4 before you leave, because I want to hear a little bit about that and watch you squirm. The Lord be with you. We give you thanks, gracious Lord our God, for all the good gifts you give to us, and especially now in this hour for the gift of food. For those who have prepared it for us and the hospitality we receive as we come here, we give you thanks and praise. Bless the fellowship and the conversation. Strengthen us through this food and this time together to go forth to serve you with joy. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. See you in an hour.